Inshallah, begin. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Can everyone see the presentation slides?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So thank you all again for joining us this evening. For those of you who are on the East Coast, in the Eastern time zone. My name is Fayaz Jafar. I'm coming to you from New York. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully sharing with you all just a little bit of insight with regards to the concept of paradise and reward within the whole of Quran. Inshallah, this is the first of a two-part course, which inshallah will resume next week. Next Wednesday, also at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so New York, Toronto time. And so we'd love to have you all participate and join us again for the second part of the conversation. For today, inshallah, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the concept of paradise and reward in the Quran, very sort of elementary, so to say, but really start off with focusing on why this conversation is important. And thereafter speak to certain realities that lead us toward an understanding of why paradise and reward, as mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, within the whole Quran, and offer some sort of theological insight into the conversation and some sort of frequently asked questions. Next week, inshallah, we'll take a deeper dive into taking a look at specific chapters of the Quran that speak about paradise and try to discuss what exactly these sort of rewards that God speaks to mean, and how hopefully, inshallah, we can also become, of course, the people of paradise. So let's go ahead and take a look and sort of begin. Just sort of as a quick exercise, and it'd be wonderful if you all participate with me over here. What is the first thought that comes to your mind when you hear the following words? Death, afterlife, hell, and heaven. Feel free to unmute yourself or perhaps utilize the chat. When you hear these words, what is the first thought that comes to your mind? And maybe we'll start with number one. When you hear the word death, I've given this exercise to many people while you're all thinking and hopefully writing them down, utilizing the chat function to do so. People often have a lot of connotations of graves, or of skeletons, or of things that are sort of very cryptic. Someone says, why should we talk about or converse about this subject in the first place? It's something frightening, it's something scary, so on and so forth. That's oftentimes because our minds are often linked with images that are immediately connoted with these terms that we're often bombarded with in media, in TV shows, on movies, or in books, whatever it might be. So what are some of these thoughts that come to your mind? Anyone have any thoughts? Again, if you can utilize the chat function, or if you're comfortable, you can also unmute yourself and share. What's the first thought that comes to your mind when you hear the word death?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
So when I think of actually number 1, 2, and 4, death, afterlife, and heaven, the first thing that comes to mind is meeting God. And then when I think of hell, that doesn't come to mind at all.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Just feel free to unmute yourself. No?
The question that comes to me is, am I ready for death or the afterlife or hell or heaven, whatever it is, right? Am I prepared for it?
Yeah. Very good. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Okay, no worries. The idea that I want to hopefully share with you all, or one of the objectives perhaps of the conversation, is to change our perspective a little bit on this, or on these terms. I feel that the way that many of us learn the religion of Islam have studied Quran from, due to culture, due to upbringing, due to environment, due to a whole host of different reasons, it doesn't really matter what they are. We often, again, consistently negatively connote terms like these, probably with the exception of heaven. Heaven obviously has a very positive vibe to it, where we recollect verses of the Quran that talk about gardens and rivers and fruits, and we'll talk about those things, inshallah, as we go, either in this conversation or in next week's conversation. But particularly for 1, 2, and 3, we don't see it as something that, obviously number 3, not so much, but number 1 and 2, not something that might be positive, or might not something that leads to some sort of consistent growth. And that's what one of the points of the conversation that we want to have today. So first of all, again, why should we even have this conversation? Why should we talk about paradise? Why should we talk about reward? Why should we talk about the world beyond this one in the first place? In reality, talking about death and our inevitable reality, which is the world beyond this one, is talking about life. The perfect example that is often given in many of our works on, classical textbooks on theology and so on, is when you have a roadmap for how you want to live your life, it's much better than not having one. Or even a more sort of, clearer example, if you leave your home and you get into your car and you have no idea where you're going, what your destination is going to be, just unfortunately, you're going to waste a lot of time. You're going to waste a lot of gas. Fuel is really expensive these days. It's much better if you know where it is that you're going. And if we know that we are headed to a world beyond this one that is far greater than this world, this tangible dunya that we are living in, then naturally, we're going to be that much more prepared to get there. And we're going to be able to create the roadmap to the best of our sort of potentials and capacities to reach the destination that we want to reach. When you have the example of someone like Imam Ali alayhi salam in comparison with someone like Muawiyah. Muawiyah is concerned solely with this world. Imam Ali alayhi salam is concerned solely with the next world. So you take a look at these two personalities, one who lives solely for this world, one who lives solely for the next world, and all of a sudden you're able to understand what difference of an impact that psyche has on the individual and how they prepare, how they live, how they engage with others, and so on and so forth. So number one, this conversation is important, meaning speaking about the world beyond this one, because it helps us in this life of ours. Reflecting on death, reflecting on the world beyond this one, allows us to prepare for this life adequately. In addition to preparing for the future and thinking about it and reflecting upon it and seeing it manifest in front of us through remembrances of death and the afterlife, what it has the capacity to do is it consistently is a reminder that I'm also going to end up in that destination. And again, influencing anything and everything that I do. It's going to influence and change my behavior with my family, my prayers and my acts of worship, my charitable contributions and giving, even sort of my hobbies in this dunya. Again, it changes everything, about the way we live life. When you go to a graveyard, no one is particularly sort of, sarcastic or sort of in a joking mood. People tend to be much more serious because it's something that hits really, really close to home. Which is why in the hadith from the Imam Ali alayhi salam, he states, "An-nasu niyam idha matu intahabu," that humanity is asleep, and when they die, they wake up, because we're entering into a new phase of our existence. And like we said before, naturally, there's a difference in the actions of someone who believes in death and in the world beyond this one, and someone who does not. So again, before we get into the conversation on paradise and reward, what is the world beyond this one? What is akhirah? The most perfect example that I like to sort of utilize is, how can we explain the color red to someone who is blind? The only thing that we have about the world beyond this one is the descriptions that are given to us by the ayat and the verses of the Holy Quran, which again, we'll take a look at many of them in today's conversation and in next week's, inshallah, and the ahadith of the Prophet and his family, peace and blessings be upon them. But in reality, the only thing that we understand about that world is what we understand from those verses and from that hadith. In other words, we're entering into a completely new dimension, into a completely new universe, so to say. But physically, we only understand what we understand via the examples and the metaphors that are given to us within the Quran and within the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Let me give you a better example or another example. When we live in the womb of our mothers, prior to being born into this dunya, when we're a fetus, if someone were to come to us and tell us that, you're going to enter into a completely new dimension, and in that world that you're going to live in, you're going to see so many colors, and you're going to eat so many types of food, and you're going to, meet so many different types of people, and you're going to, see a whole host of different, things. How could we, who have never been witness to what that world is like beyond being in the womb, comfortable, warm, fed, satiated of my mother, how could I understand anything beyond what I'm in at that given moment? You can't. Only thing that we could understand is what my mother is telling me. For instance, when you get out of, my stomach, you are going to enter into a world of wonders and of imagination and of people and of experiences. We wouldn't understand because our intellects and our physical capacity don't have the capability to understand. Which is why, again, that when we talk about our perception of the world beyond this one, when we talk about our perception of paradise, for instance, we hear about, gardens, and we hear about rivers, and we hear about fruits, and undoubtedly they're all true. But what about those fruits? What about those gardens? What about those rivers? Are they similar in any way to that which we understand in this world? Or is that just what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us because that's what we understand? Or is that just the scratching of the surface of what paradise really is like? That's probably, more closer to the truth. So that's point number one. So what is the world beyond this one? Again, it's something that is incomprehensible other than what we have from the Quran and the Ahadith of the Prophet and family, which is why conversations, at least I feel, like this are so important. What else do we know about the world beyond this one? Is that it is undoubtedly a necessary reality. It's from the sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, God has created laws that are utilized to govern this universe. The sun, rises in the east and sets in the west. That's just the way it is, because that's the way that God has created this universe. God has told us that beyond this dunya, there is another world, there is a day of judgment, a day of reckoning, and beyond that, there is what is known as alam al-khuld, this more eternal life. And we accept that because that is what law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has utilized to establish this universe. I can't logify it. I can't rationalize it. I don't understand why. Maybe I can sort of speculate, but at the end of the day, I submit to the fact that that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. He's the king, and we submit to his authority. And when we talk about the phases that we go through in the world beyond this one, for instance, the first one of them being death itself. One theory, of course, not held by Muslims or by believers of various religious traditions, is that when we die, we enter into a state of non-existence, or what is known as amrun adam, nothingness, in other words. That you die, and that's it, it's finished. There's nothing that is beyond that. And of course, the second theory is that, which is stated from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that this moment of death is a transition from one world to another, darun ila dar. In other words, we go through various phases, and the ultimate, sort of stage that the believer has the potential to reach is paradise, inshallah, in the company of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his family. So why specifically this topic? Meaning, why specifically reward and punishment? Reward and paradise, excuse me. We'll talk a little bit about punishment, but inshallah, why specifically did I select this topic? And why did I think that it was important for the sake of our conversation? Well, firstly, and again, I thought it would be a good idea for me to not always put the quotes of the Quran in English, just so, hopefully you have maybe your phone next to you, or you have another tab open where you can just quickly look it up. And I think it just helps it helps create a relationship with the Quran as well. So number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, the first reason why I chose this topic specifically to speak toward the concept of reward and paradise within the whole Quran is because number one, a large number of verses within God's book speak to it. And if God mentions it so often, it's probably important, and it's probably important for us to reflect upon them. For instance, God states within the whole Quran, لَهُمْ مَا يَشَاءُونَ فِيهَا وَلَدَيْنَا مَزِيدٌ, that in paradise, that the believers, they can have whatever they want of this paradise, of the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and God will give them more. Meaning that there is this, sort of exciting reality to paradise that we have at our fingertips at anything and everything that we desire. And again, many ayat of the whole Quran, like we're going to see, speak to paradise. So why shouldn't I be someone who learns about it, who prepares for it? If I want to go there, I might as well learn a little bit about it. If I want to, move to a particular town or to a particular city, I'm not just going to go online and call a realtor and buy a home. No, we don't do that. You're not just going to, go and visit a home or an apartment and then rent it. No, you want to go and take a look at the neighborhood, see if that's something that you like, see if it's something that you're interested in, get an understanding of all of the details about that particular town before you commit to living there. We, of course, are committed to living in paradise. Might as well know what it's like, inshallah, so that we are well prepared for it. So number one, why this topic? Number one, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to it numerous times within his book. Number two, and I think that this is important as well, in chapter 32, verse number 17, it's a source of incentive and it's inspiring and it motivates us that when we recite and when we reflect upon the verses that talk about paradise, that all of a sudden we are moved and we ourselves want a piece of that paradise, as we're going to take a look at from a hadith from Imam Ali alayhi salam, in I believe the next slide. God says in chapter 32, verse 17, فَلَا تَعْلَمُ نَفْسٌ مَا أُخْفِيَ لَهُم مِّن قُرَّةِ أَعْيُنٍ جَزَاءً بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. That in that world, they have no idea of just how much, in terms of reward, in terms of blessing, in terms of sort of, bounties and ni'am that we are going to receive. It's going to be too much. It's going to be so overwhelming. We're going to be so excited about it. And when we read these verses again that talk about the food and talk about the paradise and talk about the gardens and talk about, the couches and all of those things again that sort of get us excited, it's meant to sort of incentivize. Why should I, pray or stand up in the middle of the night or engage in acts of worship? Of course, at the end of the day, the objective is not paradise. It's to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But on the way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that we are a human being who loves incentive and who loves physical, tangible things, right? We, the believer, and even the non-believer, we go to work and we fulfill our duties and our responsibilities at our place of employment because we get a paycheck at the end of the day. No one is going to work for free for the entirety of their life and exhaust themselves if there's not some sort of compensation in return for them. Of course, sometimes we will, sometimes we do charitable work and so on and so forth. And that's, our account is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But generally speaking, we're not going to dedicate our lives toward a life of complete and utter and absolute sort of distance and abstinence from this dunya. No. God wants us to work. God wants us to earn a living, so on and so forth. So when we read, so when we go to a place of employment, we're hoping to get a paycheck. When we do a job, when we do a task, we are hoping to get reciprocated. And over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he tells us exactly how he is going to reward us for the good deeds that we do. And that's meant to be a source of incentive and motivation for us. And the third reason why I decided to sort of speak to this topic is because, again, I really believe that it changes our perspective and changes our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One verse that's mentioned within chapter 76, verse number 20, God states, وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ ثُمَّ رَأَيْتَ نَعِيمًا وَمُلْكًا كَبِيرًا. That in paradise, that we're going to take a look and then we're going to take another look, a second glance at the blessings in this massive kingdom that we have at our disposal. What I mean when I say that it changes our perspective is that, like I said before, when we go back to that first slide, I think for many people, when they hear words like that of death, or they hear words like that of the afterlife, they become fearful. And it's frightening to us to think about transitioning from this world to the next. Like someone had mentioned earlier, that are we really well prepared for this? That's something that I think about, something we often think about. It's important for us to know, and again, not to sound cliche, but with all sincerity, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He cares for the believer. And He cares for the human being. He cares for His creation, every single one of us. And our perception many a times is this very negative deficit approach, of how we understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People picture this very angry God, a God who's ready to punish, a God who's ready to take vengeance on His creation. No, that's not the case. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to put us in into positions and in places where we can be successful in the dunya and successful in the akhirah, which is a kind God, a merciful God, a compassionate God, a generous God. And we know that through His names and through His attributes. And when we talk about paradise, as opposed to talking about punishment, again, speaking about paradise and all of the rewards and the bounties and the mercy and the compassion and the grace and so on and so forth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we begin to love that God. And we begin to enter into a state whereby we love also to be in His worship, and we love to be in a state of His obedience. Many a time, people, they have this perception that if I teach my children by telling them about punishment or about how Allah will be upset with them or how Allah will be mad at them, that all of a sudden we'll scare them into worship. That's never worked. Doesn't work in a classroom, doesn't work at home when we try to be sort of very disciplinarian sort of types with our children. And undoubtedly, it's not going to work, within the psychology of the human being, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were only to present Himself that way. Of course, there needs to be a balance. But at the end of the day, we speak so much less, or we engage conversation so much less about paradise and reward, in contrast with punishment and so on and so forth. So again, why did we choose this topic to speak on reward and paradise within the whole Quran and within our tradition? Number one, because God speaks to it so often within His book. Number two, because it gives us a little bit of incentive and motivation to act and to seek to be our best. And number three, it changes our perspective and our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with ourselves as well, inshallah. But that begs a question. And I think that, over the next couple of slides, again, before we jump into the topic, which we'll speak to in more detail during next week's conversation, the first question that someone might ask is, okay, if you say, oh, Fayaz Jaffer from New York, that God is this kind God and He's this merciful God, then why do we die? Why does He take away the bounties that He gives us in this dunya and not just, allow for us to live forever and benefit from this world? Like I said before, again, we are not created for life, but we're created for something far more important. Again, like we said before, that when we were in the womb of our mother, that we don't know what life is like beyond that. But now that we have been exposed to this world, how many of us, would want to go back and think about it? When I was a fetus in the care and the tender support and the love of my mom, at the end of the day, would I ever imagine that life beyond that would be better? No, I was warm. I was satiated. I was closest to the one who loves me the most in this universe. But then I enter into this dunya and I am worried, I'm scared, I cry. And I don't know what this life is like. A child, when they enter into the world, they scream and they cry and they go through a whole host of, separation anxiety every time their mother turns their back from them and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't create us solely to receive that sense of care from our mother in that world. He created us for this dunya. And then there's a certain sort of expiry date for this dunya for us to enter into a new phase. And it might be scary, it might be worrisome, but that same God who cared for you in the womb of your mother, the same God who cared for us when we entered into this world, will undoubtedly care for us in the world beyond this one. So again, to change our perspective in terms of who God is, We die because we're entering into a new stage. It's growth. It might be difficult. It might be challenging. But every growth, every moment of growth and transition in life is a bit challenging. God says within the Holy Quran, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ أَمَلًا وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْغَفُورُ, in the oft-quoted verse of Al-Mulk, that surely God is the one who has created death and he has created life. And he precedes death with life. I created death before I created life. وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ, such that he may try us. أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ أَمَلًا, which one of us are going to do good deeds? وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْغَفُورُ, meaning this world is a trial. Like we know, this world is a world of trials and tribulations that are intrinsically linked to us. At the end of the day, we are not here forever, like we know, but we're here for a purpose. And so it's important for us to understand and recognize that purpose and embrace it and realize that there might be something that is better for us. And when, again, we read these verses, like we said before, about reward, then again, we feel incentivized and motivated, and we realize that there's something more for us. Why would I want to limit myself to being in the womb of my mother when I could, travel the world and I could spend time with members of my family and I could enjoy the pleasures of this dunya and I could go through all of the wonderful experiences that I go through? If you were to ask anyone, would you prefer to be in this world at this moment in spite of everything that you're going through, or be in the womb of your mother? Again, unless we're having a really bad day, we'd say, no, we're comfortable here. This is the life that God has chosen for us. We appreciate being here. Similarly, as we transition from this world to the next, again, there's a sense of sort of growth for us in the process. So then why do people fear this sort of transition from this world to the next? And the question I guess we pose is, does everyone really sort of fear death? Ali alayhi salam never feared death. The Prophet of God sallallahu alayhi wa never feared death. Imam al-Hussein, as the army of Umar bin Sa'ad, they themselves narrated on the 10th of Muharram, after he had lost everyone, they would say, Unduru ilayhi, la yubali bil maut. Look at this man. Death doesn't faze him, as mentioned in one of the Maqatil literature. So in other words, Eastern and Western philosophers say human beings have a natural inclination to live forever, or the sense of love for immortality, immortality, not immorality, excuse me, that's a typo. A love for to be immortal, to live forever. The first group are individuals who, of course, don't believe in God. Naturally, they fear death because they're entering into nothingness, like we said before. Secondly, we fear this transition because of our attachment to this world. But when we think about, and when we realize, and when we understand, and when we appreciate the world beyond this one, and we reflect upon these verses of paradise and reward, it shatters our love for this dunya. Let me give you an example. If you have, cheese sandwich in front of you for dinner, something very, very simple. Not to say that eating a cheese sandwich is bad, but if you have a really, really simple meal in front of you for dinner and you're starving and you have this sandwich in front of you and you look at it and you don't see it to be so particularly appetizing, but you're hungry, so you're going to end up, indulging in it in just a moment. And then someone came to you and said, wait a minute, if you don't take a bite of that sandwich right now, I'm going to take you out for a really delicious steak. Or I am going to take you to eating some really fantastic, rice and juicy kebab. I don't know, whatever it is. Most people would be able to have a little bit of willpower and stop themselves from eating the food that they really don't want to eat for that food which is far better for them and which they're going to enjoy that much more. We, many people, and I speak to myself before anyone else, are fearful of the transition from this world to the next because we are only looking at that unappetizing meal in front of us. Once I start to learn a little bit more about what I have the potential to eat in terms of that steak or in terms of that kebab, or, for the sake of our example, once I have the potential to realize what paradise is like in the world beyond this one, my desire for this world is going to fade, because I'm going to say, who cares about all this when I can get that? And that is far better. And again, that's another reason why I think this conversation is so important. And again, there's a third group of people, who are in the proximity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they're not concerned about this world. The only thing they could think about is Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and realizing that transitioning from this world to the next and being a recipient of the blessing and of the mercy and of the compassion and of the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala itself is what it is that they're desiring. As Imam Ali alayhi salam says to one of his companions, Hal ra'ayta habiban yukrahu liqa al-habib. He says, have you ever seen someone in love who doesn't want to be in the company or doesn't want to meet their beloved? In other words, that the Prophet ﷺ and his family, peace and blessings be upon them, they saw this transition from this dunya into the akhirah as an opportunity to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they look forward to that process, and they look forward to that journey. Okay. So before we again speak to reward and paradise within the Quran, just a couple of important sort of prerequisites. It's important to understand essentially who is the human being to be a recipient of this reward or punishment in the first place. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the human being with both a body and a soul. We have a physical bodily dimension, and at the same time, we have a spiritual, sort of metaphysical dimension that is linked to the human being. The bodily dimension is this physical body that we have. We have senses, we have desires that need to be satiated, and the primary concern of the body is diet, sleep, intimacy, diet meaning food and drink. We need to sleep. And at the end of the day, they need to be satiated in order for us to continue to exist, in this dunya. If we don't eat for a long period of time, if we don't drink for a long period of time, if we don't sleep for a long period of time, it will impact our health and could potentially even lead to fatality. In other words, the body is concerned with, again, these physical realities that we are attached and that we are linked to. And I think for us, it's fairly obvious in terms of what the body does or what it needs. On the flip side, God has created us also with a soul or with a spiritual dimension. And, theologically, there's a difference in terms of how we understand this sort of spiritual dimension. Is it the nafs? Is it the ruh? That's for another conversation, not for today. And it's important to understand that the spiritual dimension of the human being is that metaphysical reality. Metaphysical meaning that we can't tangibly sort of tangify it. It's not something that I can touch. It's not something that I can mold. It's not something that I can smell. It's not something that I can bite. It's not something that I can taste. It's not something that I can hold in my hand like I hold my phone, or like I hold this book, or like I hold my water bottle. The soul, or the spiritual dimension of the human being, is something, again, that is metaphysical. But nonetheless, there's a stark relationship between the two, the body and the soul. In some capacity, they interlock or they interlink. So there is a direct link between the body and the ruh, the soul of the human being. And enjoyments and pleasures of this world are actually of the ruh, okay? And I'll explain what that means in just one moment. And they are of two types. Like we said before, the body needs certain prerequisites to be fulfilled in order for it to be satiated. But at the end of the day, we don't need so much in the way that we often think that we need. In other words, for instance, during the month of Ramadan, our bodies can survive on very little food and also very little sleep. As long as the spiritual dimension of the human being is satiated, the body itself doesn't need so much to survive. Let me give you an example, or the example that is often presented by many of our theologians and scholars of Islamic ethics. That when we have a desire to seek knowledge, when we are engaged in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when we are fasting during the month of Ramadan, when we are supplicating in dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you're performing tawaf around the Holy Kaaba. I just came back from ziyarah every winter break during Christmas time and so on. I take a group of about 50 or so young folks from within the community and so on. And the entire group sleeps very little. They eat very little. They're exhausted by the end of the trip. But they didn't realize they were exhausted because they were engaged in something that gave them a heightened level of spirituality, so to say. And you can go back to your own examples, be it during the month of Ramadan, when you go for Hajj, you go for Umrah, you go for the ziyarat of the Ahlul Bayt, alayhim as-salam. You're so engaged in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that your concern is not food. Your concern is not sleep. That's the last thing you're thinking about, you know? You're not concerned about work. You're not concerned about bills. You're not concerned about any of the distractions of this world because you are solely engaged in the remembrance of God. And you only take what you need, a little bit of sleep, a little bit of food, and you're not concerned with anything else. But many a time when there's a gap in terms of how much our souls have been satiated, we don't have access or too much engagement with prayers or with dhikr or with dua or with the seeking of knowledge, then at the end of the day, the body wants more. In other words, we begin to idly eat and we begin to engage in more sleep or whatever it might be. So that's why I write in that last bullet point, in the first level, if the first level of enjoyment is not satiated, it will steer toward these bodily pleasures as a means to compensate. And again, the human being needs some, at the very least, bodily pleasures to be satiated, like that of food, like that of beautiful scenery, like I note, like that of friendship, like that of intimacy, like that of sleep. We need it, undoubtedly. It's important. But when you have so much of the remembrance of Allah to fill your heart, that becomes secondary. And this is all very, very important to us understanding, again, as prerequisites, what reward is like in the world beyond this one. That's why I just mentioned it really, really quickly in this slide. Okay. Let's sort of shift gears, but maybe I'll just stop for just a moment. Does anyone have any questions? Otherwise, I'll continue talking too much. Okay, we'll go back to the slides, inshallah, and then we'll have time for questions toward the end. Very good. So now that we have a sort of an understanding, at least periphery, of why this conversation is important, and in addition to what the human being goes through in terms of transitioning from this world to the next world and hopefully being a recipient of paradise, I wanted to speak to some of the characteristics of the people of paradise as mentioned by Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam, as famously narrated in his hadith, known as his famous sermon known as Khutbat al-Muttaqeen, which is sermon 192 or 193 of Nahj al-Balagha. Many of you may have heard it before, in which Imam Ali alayhi salam, he outlines more than approximately 200 qualities of those who have taqwa, those who have God consciousness. And one particular line I wanted to reflect upon before we get into the next segment of slides, but I thought to take the whole passage just for all of our benefit. The people of paradise, and in the eyes of Ali, the people of God awareness, God consciousness. فَالْمُتَّقُونَ فِيهَا هُمْ أَهْلُ الْفَضَائِلِ مَنْتَقُهُمُ الصَّوَابُ وَمَلْبَسُهُمْ الْاقْتِسَادِ. The Imam alayhi salam, he says, the God-fearing, those who have taqwa, they are the people of distinction. They are the people of merit. And then toward the end of this particular segment of the sermon, just going to the last couple of sentences, he states, أَدُمَ الْخَالِقُ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ فَسَغُرَ مَا دُونَهُ فِي أَعْيُنِهِمْ. The greatness of the Creator is seated in their heart. And so everything else appears small in their eyes. The only thing they see is God. Nothing else is important to them. فَهُمْ وَالْجَنَّةُ كَمَنْ قَدْ رَآهَا. This is the important line. Thus to them, paradise is as though they see it. فَهُمْ فِيهَا مُنَعَّمُونَ. And they see themselves reaping the reward of paradise every moment when they remember it. So for instance, when you go through a verse of the Quran and you're reading, and it mentions what paradise is like, you see yourself also receiving that reward. God wants us to be that. He wants us to be in that state. Imam Ali alayhi salam is saying that is a quality of the believer. وَهُمْ وَالنَّارُ كَمَنْ قَدْ رَآهَا. The same goes for punishment. To them, hell is also as if they see it. فَهُمْ فِيهَا مُؤَدَّبُونَ. And they see themselves every time they remember hell and punishment, they see themselves being the victim of it, being a suffering via that punishment. So when we reflect upon these verses of paradise, it's not such solely that you read these verses and you're engaging in some sort of intellectual discourse. When we talk about tadabbur or contemplation of the whole Quran, is in reading it, the ayat, the verses, but also seeing yourself in those anecdotes, for instance, that are mentioned about Nuh or about Ibrahim or about Musa or about Isa or about Yaqub and Yusuf. You see yourself in the anecdote. You put yourself in their shoes, so to say. How would you act? How would you respond? Similarly, when we hear the story of Karbala and the story of Ashura, we often sort of see ourselves in the plains of Karbala. Who would I side with? Would I be with Imam al-Hussein? Would I be with the army of Amr ibn Sa'd? Would I have had the courage like that of Har to sort of shift everything that was going well for me, for instance? We see ourselves in it. Similarly, when we read the ayat and the verses of paradise, we should also see ourselves in paradise, reaping the reward. Again, so it incentivizes, so it motivates us, so it inspires us, so it changes our perspective. Similarly, when we read the ayat and the verses of punishment, we also see ourselves. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from it. So we are engaging with the Quran in that way. I thought that was really, really important based on this famous lengthy sermon of the Imam alayhi salam. Okay. So I wanted to take a look, at some ayat of the Holy Quran that speak now to paradise, but speak to what I call over here the theology of reward in paradise. In other words, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created a reward and punishment within the Holy Quran? In chapter number 3, Surah Al-Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for those of you who would like to go ahead and take a look as well, chapter number 3, verse number 131, he states, وَاتَّقُوا النَّارَ الَّتِي أُعِدَّتْ لِلْكَافِرِينَ. He says, and guard yourselves and protect yourselves from that fire which has been prepared for the unbelievers, for those who don't have any faith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He commands us, وَاتَّقُوا النَّارَ. Protect yourself from that punishment. وَأَتِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَالرَّسُولَ لَأَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. And obey God and obey the Prophet so that you might be a recipient of God's mercy. Step number 1 is to remind ourselves that there's punishment. Step number 2 is to follow God's instruction and the instruction of the Prophet so that we will be admitted into God's mercy. Number 3, وَسَارَعُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَجَنَّةٍ أَرْضُهَا السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And then he says, and rush toward the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you will then find paradise, who is so expansive and extensive that it is comprehensive of the heavens and the earth. How big is paradise? How massive is it? How detailed is it? How beautiful is it? It's bigger than the heavens and the earth. أُعِدَّتْ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, which God has reserved for those who have taqwa, for those who protect themselves from fire, those who protect themselves from punishment, from those who protect themselves from committing sin. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that paradise has been created, but punishment has been created. Hell and paradise, there are two realities. And each and every one of them has certain characteristics of individuals who will be admitted into them. If we want to be a people of paradise, that which we are seeking is God's mercy, is God's compassion. How do we get there? Obedience to God and obedience to His Prophet. Pretty simple, right? Obey God and obey the messenger, you will be admitted into God's mercy. Once you continuously seek that mercy and that forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll be admitted into paradise. Sort of a 3-step process. Obey God, obey the Prophet, ask for forgiveness when you make a mistake. Pretty sort of simple. And that brings me then to the next question. So I said we wanted to ask a couple of, frequently asked questions, so to say. Number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about this paradise and He talks about this punishment. But are we working toward paradise? I'll speak more about this next week, inshallah, just in the interest of time. So we'll skip the slide, but really quickly, no. The ultimate goal is not paradise. The ultimate goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His closeness and proximity. Paradise is a means to that end, though. Inshallah, we'll talk about more about that next week. But I wanted to focus on these two questions. If God Himself is merciful, subhanahu wa ta'ala, then why don't we all go to paradise? People ask this all the time. And why hell and punishment? Number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He so chose, He could have admitted everyone into paradise. But like we know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also a just God, is an equitable God. And it would be unfair of Him subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the believers, for Him to place, for instance, Imam Hussein in the same paradise as He places Umar ibn Sa'd. Doesn't work that way. Then why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, create hell and punishment and don't just, for instance, put everyone in paradise and put everyone on different levels? Like we know there are different levels to paradise as well, like we'll talk about inshallah next week. I wrote down 3 of the reasons that are mentioned within the Quran and within the Hadith literature, but there are many others as well. The first one of them in a Hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, he says, Inna Allah khalaqa an-nar rahmatan yukhawwif biha liyantahu. The first reason why God has created hell and punishment in the first place is as a mercy to the believer, to scare us or to frighten us such that we see it as a deterrent. In other words, that God created hell and punishment as a deterrent. And like we said before, and I want to stress this point, my friends, that at the end of the day, we are not going to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala solely through the lens of sort of this disciplinarian sort of God that many of us perceive. The way that we teach our communities, the way that we teach our friends, the way that we teach our children is not solely through, frightening them into obedience. That doesn't work that way. Once in a while, though, it does work. I'll give you an example. I teach several courses at the university here, and I've learned from some of my seniors that one of the best ways to get students to participate in class and to be on time and to be vigilant and sort of diligent and focused from the very minute that class starts is to create an attendance policy, where you tell them that 3 lates or 2 lates to class equals an absence, and every absence is a deduction of your grade. And I've been sort of implementing that. And I say on the first day of class, like, many of you may do as well, or, many of you may have experienced as well, is that, look, I tell my students that at the end of the day, my job is to, teach you this material. And the only way that I can teach you this material appropriately and adequately is if you show up to class on time. I tell them on day 1, if you do not show up to class on time, you are going to get points deducted from your final grade. They see their final grade as the ultimate objective. Every student, when they walk into class on the first day of school, they want to get an A, right? Very quickly, they might realize that they're not A students, but nonetheless, they have the desire to get an A in class. Creating that deterrent from them for not coming late immediately put something in their mind that, I better come to class on time. Similarly, when we see that there might be some accountability, it definitely serves as a deterrent. But again, that's not the only reason why, like we said, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or that's not the only way that we should understand our Creator. So again, number 1, that it is a deterrent from committing acts of sin or transgression. Number 2, that at the end of the day, the human being realizes that there are consequences during the course of life. that there is accountability. Number one, it serves as a deterrent. Number two, it's sort of a reality check. Wait a minute, I have to make sure that I'm fulfilling my obligations, being kind to my family members, not being abusive to my spouse or to my children, or so on and so forth, that there are consequences, and that one day, it might not be in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold me to account. And that's frightening. And not only is that frightening, but it awakens us to something far more important. And thirdly, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create this hell or this punishment in the world beyond this one for no reason. We are sort of all created for paradise, but the exception is punishment. وَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا وَلَنْ تَفْعَلُوا فَاتَّقُوا النَّارَ الَّتِي وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْكَافِرِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this fire that He created and this sort of eternal punishment that He subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, its fuel is human beings, meaning that we ourselves, the human being, due to our sins and due to our transgressions, we have created this reality. So it's important for us to look internally and consistently seek forgiveness from Allah Azza wa Jal. We'll take a look at this slide also next week. Let's go ahead and conclude with a small brief reflection. If I can kindly ask you all to take a look at chapter 36 of the Holy Quran, Surah Yasin, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, beginning with verse number 55. We'll take a look at these ayat, and then we'll open it up for some questions in the last couple of minutes, inshallah, here. Chapter 36 of the Holy Quran, Surah Yasin, verse number 55. God states, subhanahu wa ta'ala, Inna ashab al-jannat al-yawma fi shughulin fakihun. So let's take our first glance into what paradise looks like after all of these introductions that we've spoken to. Inna ashab al-jannat al-yawma fi shughulin fakihun. God, He states, surely the people of paradise, on that day, their job is to enjoy. Their job is to be happy. Hum wa azwajuhum fi dhilalin ala al-ara'iki muttaki'un. They and their companions, they shall be under shade, reclining on raised couches. Lahum fiha fakihatun wa lahum ma yadda'un. They shall have fruits in that paradise, and they shall have whatever it is that they desire. Salamun qawlan min Rabbir Rahim. Peace, a word from the all-merciful Lord. Let's go through these ayat one by one. Firstly, verse number 55. Inna ashab al-jannat al-yawma fi shughulin fakihun. And again, I would really appreciate if everyone was able to also follow along on their phones or opening up Quran next to them, whatever it might be. Chapter 36, Surah Yasin, verse number 55. Surely the people of paradise, inna ashab al-jannat al-yawma fi shughulin fakihun. Their only job, their only preoccupation shall be to be in a state of enjoyment. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. In reality, we can't explain it because we've never experienced anything like that. Think about a moment, for instance, when you were in utter and absolute happiness. You were on vacation, for instance, or you were not working and you were just spending time with the ones that you love. We know that in this dunya, that every single moment of enjoyment is going to come to an end. It's sort of transient. I remember one day, that might help sort of elucidate the point over here. One day I was speaking to a group of high school students from, at a local Sunday school over here. And so you figure they're about 14 or 15 or 16 years old. And I asked this group of students, I told them that what is the best day? What was the best day of your life? What was the most enjoyable day that you've had? And there was one very brave student, probably again, 13, 14, 15 years old, I don't know. He raised his hand and he was making a joke, but he was speaking from his heart. And he said, the best day of my life was the last day of school before summer vacation. I said, oh, that's good. Last day of school. You look forward to 2.5 months of no school. And, think about when we were kids, we used to look forward to the summer vacation. So then I asked him right away, I said, and what is the worst day of the year? And he raised his hand and he said that the day before summer vacation ends. So I asked him, I said, why the day before summer vacation ends and not the first day of school? So he said, the last day of summer vacation, the day before school, his stomach starts to hurt, starts to get anxious, starts to get nervous, starts to worry about what life might be like. And he can't even enjoy that last day anymore. And if you think about it, every moment of happiness and of bliss and of joy and of contentment and of comfort in this dunya is always quickly closed because we realize that is never going to end. That's never going to, it's not going to last forever. Eventually, there is a sort of reality check that we have to go through. But the exception is paradise. God, he states, Inna ashabal jannat al-yawma fi shughulin fakihun. In that world, no anxiety, no stress, no pressure, nothing to be nervous about. Your only responsibility, the people of paradise, us inshallah, our only task, our only job is to enjoy, is to just be happy. That's it. We have nothing else to worry about. Verse number 56. Hum wa azwajuhum fi dhilalin ala al-ara'iki muttaki'un. They and their wives shall be in shades, reclining on raised couches. And according to other commentators of the Holy Quran, it's not limited to your spouse, but it also is comprehensive of anyone whom you enjoy their company, anyone who's your companion, anyone who's your friend. Hum wa azwajuhum fi dhilalin ala al-ara'iki muttaki'un. So we will be not only alone in that paradise with the one job, which is to be in a state of enjoyment, but in addition to that, hum wa azwajuhum, that we will be in the company of those whom we love. We'll be with our family. We'll be with our children. We'll be with those who we care about. Someone says, for instance, what if I want to get a break from my family in paradise? Well, you're going to enjoy the company of your friends and your family in that world. You'll only be with those who you want to be with in that world, in their company, inshallah. Hum wa azwajuhum fi dhilalin ala al-ara'iki muttaki'un. If someone, I was asking everyone before we hit the play button and before everyone had joined, where they were based and what the weather's like and just whatever, making small talk. And over here in New York right now is January, it's freezing cold. I'm sure the same in Toronto. I know some of you mentioned you were in Vancouver. I was in Vancouver a month ago as well, and it was freezing there as well. What is the weather in paradise like? Probably it's perfect, it's pleasant, it's sunny. God says that in paradise, again, we're going to be sitting in this probably very comfortable weather, and we're going to be sitting on couches, and we're going to be reclined because we don't like to sit with good posture. And we will be shaded because even when it's the most perfect, beautiful weather, we don't want that sun to, burn our heads. Sitting under it for too long might get a little bit uncomfortable. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says there will be the shade for us so that we are in utter and absolute bliss and comfort. Again, with that sort of precision and with that sort of detail. So again, we'll be with our only job is to be happy, is to be in a state of enjoyment. Who will we be with? We'll be with the ones whom we love. How will we be seated? We'll be seated on these comfortable chairs. We'll be seated in perfect weather. We'll be seated reclined. We'll be seated on these couches. Again, lahum fiha, God continues, lahum fiha fakihatun wa lahum ma yadda'un. He states, and in that paradise, don't worry, there'll be food there. You will have whatever fruits that you choose. Lahum fiha fakihatun. Someone says, I don't want fruits. I want, a burger. Wa lahum ma yadda'un. No worries, you will have whatever it is that you please. Again, what is paradise? Our intellects can't comprehend the benefits and the blessings of the world beyond this one. Lahum fiha fakihatun wa lahum ma yadda'un. And in verse number 58, Salamun qawlan min Rabbir Rahim. Peace, a word from the All-Merciful Lord. And this is the most important one. What does this mean? In verse number 58, Now imagine you're seated with your friends and you're eating all of this delicious food, and you're seated with your family and all of those whom you love. You're seated comfortably. You've been told that you don't worry about anything. You have nothing to worry about today. Sometimes in life, we want validation. We want to share good news with those whom we love. We want people to tell us that we did a good job. Over here, we don't get the validation from our mother, from our father, from our spouse, from our children, from our friends. No, we get validation from the Lord of the worlds. It is stated that we will be seated in this paradise and will be recipients of all of these unique blessings. And according to the commentators of the Holy Quran, then angels will descend upon us and say, Salam, peace. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent us to tell you and to grant you his peace and his blessings, his salam, his greeting. And he wants to tell you that this paradise is for you. And he has given it to you out of his mercy and out of his grace. Salam, qawlan min Rabbir Rahim. And at that moment, we will feel this sense of happiness and contentment, unlike any other contentment that we've ever felt, because again, we've been validated by the Lord of the worlds. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at that moment, he promised us and he commits to us that you don't have to worry about the difficulties of this world and the trials and tribulations of this dunya. In that world, in that paradise, it's eternal and it's for us, and we will have the ability to benefit how we please because of our efforts in this world, insha'Allah ta'ala. I'll stop here for today, inshallah. Next week, we'll go through some other verses of the Holy Quran that speak to paradise and speak to some of its details. And hopefully, we can utilize that as a sense of motivation and incentive for us in terms of us building our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad. We will stop over here for some questions or some comments, or if anyone has any thoughts they'd like to share. Does anyone have any comments?
So, Sheikh, is that why death is mentioned before life? All this we're talking about, is it because that's the eternal? Because it kind of makes you wonder, why is death mentioned before life in that ayah?
So going back to that verse, which is in Surah Al-Mulk, chapter 67 of the Holy Quran, God says, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ, that he has created death and he has created life. And let me just say this one point, that there's a difference of opinion, at least from my reading, from different mufassirin of the Holy Quran, with regards to why God proceeds with death before he mentions life. Perhaps it's because, and again, speculation and based on what some commentators of the Quran they state, is that God proceeds with conversation about death in order to awaken the reader, you and I, to recognizing that that life or that world beyond this one is very, very close to us. So he begins by speaking about the creation of death prior to the creation of death. It's prior to the creation of life as an opportunity for us to start to think about it. And again, naturally, we don't want to see death as something solely negative, right? Of course, it's fearful because it's something that we don't know. And we don't know what that world is going to look like. But at the end of the day, if we see it as sort of a growth opportunity and a step in the direction of getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then inshallah, we see it as something that is positive. Like when someone passes away, we call them marhum or marhuma, someone who is sort of, enveloped in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that again is something beautiful. That is something that we're seeking. So this is one perhaps reason why God proceeds with a mention of the creation of death before life. Hopefully that was clear.
Thank you.
Of course. Please, if anyone has any other thoughts, we still have a couple of more minutes.
I had a question.
Please.
Where you mentioned about the rule being impacted by two different things. It's one where you satisfy the body, and that has a impact on the ruh, and then your spiritual duties that you do that also has an impact on the ruh. Have any of the imams or maybe the Prophet mentioned maybe how to strike a balance, or what would be a balance between, so that you're optimizing both for your ruh?
Yeah, it's beautiful. Excellent. Maybe we can start off with that conversation next week. I'll try to dig up some hadith on that. But virtually, yeah. The idea is that when we proceed, and maybe I'll just go to the slide that might be helpful for people to visualize. When we want to sort of understand this particular concept of how to find that balance, the idea is to understand, again, at the end of the day, that we are this creation that has a body and a soul, a physical and a spiritual, so to say. And at the end of the day, the spiritual precedes the physical because it lives much longer than this body. The body is going to die, like we know. But at the same time, we have been given this body, so we need to care for it appropriately, and recognize that. When it comes to feeding or sort of seeking towards satiating the body, food, sleep, drink, intimacy, friendship, so on and so forth, all of that, as long as we channel our intention such that it is directed toward the ultimate objective, which is seeking closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what we're looking forward to. That's sort of the objective, and that's the ultimate goal. Then all of a sudden, that in and of itself translates into feeding of the spiritual capacity. So to sort of exemplify that, if I eat because my food gives me energy to fulfill my responsibilities to my family by going to work, by giving me the energy to play with my children. In other words, my intentionality beyond my food is, for God's sake, then at the end of the day, the feeding of my body becomes an act of worship. My making of money, for instance, and earning a living at the end of the day to spend on my family, to fulfill my religious duties, even if it might be, to live comfortably, so whatever it might be, at the end of the day, that's a means toward getting to the ultimate end, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that itself translates into an act of obedience, an act of worship in and of itself. So I think it starts, and let me know if this is answering your question, but it starts with a sense of mindfulness or intentionality beyond why it is that we're doing what it is that we're doing. Excessive sleep, right, or too deficient sleep is a problem. So how do you find that balance, and how do you find that sort of virtue, so to say? That requires diligence, and I think for every individual it's different. So there's not sort of one particular roadmap or sort of prescription that can be given to everyone. It doesn't say, for instance, you should only eat this many calories or sleep this many hours, particularly for the fulfillment of your spiritual journey, so to say. No, rather it is for the individual to assess and then to hold ourselves accountable. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Yes.
Great, wonderful.
Thank you.
Of course. Does anyone else have any questions? Maybe we take a couple more if there are.
Sheikh, you mentioned the hereafter, the food and the the clothing and the couches and all that, and we're having like a great time and wonderful life. Is to me it sounds like dunya. Like I thought akhirah is to go back to Allah and be closer and closer and closer to Him. Like when we go to madrasa and we learn about Him, is there something like that over there to get to a higher realm with Him?
Beautiful, beautiful question. Thank you for sharing. So yes, absolutely. Why I chose these verses to take a look at first, go back to a point that I had mentioned earlier, is that what we actually know, again, about paradise is solely that which is mentioned within the Quran and the Hadith, because our intellects don't have the capacity to grasp the full reality of it. And so God presents to us these small examples of things that are physical and tangible, because that's the way that the human being understands things. If God had mentioned that, in paradise, you will have the opportunity to, learn and study more, it's less sort of incentivizing for someone in comparison with you're going to eat really good food and the food's going to be delicious and you'll never have to, worry about food poisoning, for instance, or, stomach bloating, or, acidity or whatever it might be, right? Excuse my examples. The idea, again, is that it sort of creates a door by which we want to walk through. Undoubtedly, and we'll talk about this as we continue the conversation, that the ultimate sort of, pleasure in paradise is the fact that we are in close company to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, not physical, in sort of spiritual. That's why I mentioned that even when God mentions or speaks to these, beautiful manifestations of paradise, the food and the couches and all the things that you mentioned and that we mentioned, it's going to conclude with salam qawlan min Rabbir Rahim, a reminder that this is from Allah and that this word has been revealed to you, it's spoken to you, that God will envelope us in His mercy to that extent where He will appoint an angel to come to us to tell us that we are welcome here, and that itself is more valuable than any of the the couches or the food or the gardens or whatever it might be. And we do have some hadith, for instance, that talk about how our ma'rifah for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah we'll try to touch on some of these things next week, how our ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will increase when we're in paradise, where we'll have the opportunity that through His dhikr and through His remembrance and through His praises, we are again able to get closer to Him. But at the end of the day, what does that look like? We don't have the information and the detail, so we utilize what we have from the Quran and from the Hadith to give us the motivation and the incentive to hopefully reach that paradise, inshallah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikhna.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
This is Muhammad from Dubai. I don't know if you remember me.
Of course I remember. How are you? Well, inshallah.
Jazakallah. It's finally great to talk to you.
Alhamdulillah.
To see you in person, although by mobile.
Allah bless you. Thank you so much.
Once I was small, and because I love chai, my mom was like in Jannah, there will not be chai, there'll be only daram.
Inshallah, in paradise, like Allah says, that you will have whatever you wish. That you will have whatever you wish, and inshallah, the tea of paradise is far better than the tea. It undoubtedly will be far better than the tea the chai of this dunya.
Inshallah, please pray for us, and please, we hope to see you back in Dubai, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.
Allah bless you. Anyone else have any final thoughts or questions before we maybe conclude for this evening?
Sheikh,
Yes.
sorry, I know this topic is a bit, my question is a bit, it's to do with paradise only, but it's on a different point. Do I have your permission?
Please go ahead. Please go ahead. We'll see if it's not relevant, we can save it for next time, but please, why don't you go ahead?
There is two hadiths that there is beer over beer, except for the one who yuqtalu fi sabilillah. And then there is another hadith which Imam Hussein told that the ink of the scholar is greater. So how do we put these
How do you
two
reconcile?
together?
Yeah. I'll have to look into it, inshallah. I'll have to look into it and think about that one. I don't have an answer off the top of my mind.
Inshallah.
But
Thank you.
perhaps they can be read contextually, but we'll have to look into that properly, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Allah. Thank you so much. Okay, with that then maybe inshallah we'll leave it for this evening. We'll see you all next week inshallah at the same time, and keep us in your du'as, and we'll speak soon inshallah. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi tayyibin at-tahirin.